Hello literature connoisseurs. Let's begin. Chapter 6 begins with the chapter opening stating that Rayford had not been drunk in a long time. A quick flashback to him and his wife arguing over him drinking. His wife becomes a prude and wants them to be absolutely truthful with their preteen son. Then she goes on to say that Rayford needs to hide that he drinks quote, the hard stuff, end quote. Rayford counters that was being dishonest. She uses a strange example about if his flight crew is going to the bathroom, he doesn't announce in detail what they are doing, which doesn't fit this situation at all. Just like announcing that someone is going to the bathroom or that someone drinks the hard stuff is on the same level. It's not describing those actions in detail. The real question is, why must the boy live such a sheltered life that he cannot know that his father drinks? Even if the rapture was never to take place in his lifetime, because the rapture will never happen, studies have shown that over-coddling and sheltering children hinders them when they are forced to interact with the world in general. The chapter goes on to say that Rayford could not counter her example. This is stupid. It takes less than a second to counter her lame example by any thinking person. Next, Rayford downs 3 fingers of whiskey, and as he gets ready to pour himself more shots, he decides to toss the remaining away in the trash to honor his wife. Rayford makes a mental note of what he needs to do next, but his thoughts keep drifting to the fact that he's upset that he can't see the bodies of his wife and son. He seems to think he can find peace if he could see their bodies like he did when his parents died long ago. Next, we learn that he is hungry and that the envelope his wife gave him as part of that Love Dare challenge was 2 cookies. He decided to save them and go looking for others that she must have prepared. He nurses down the cookies as he thinks of her because they all him to think of her as he does. He does a few other things not worth mentioning other than saying he is grieving. Rayford is stunned that he had missed the nonsense his wife had been spouting for years and wonders why he missed it. Probably because she seems to babble incoherently. We finally get to some theology as Rayford wonders what happens next now that the real Christians have been taken away. Several problems are happening here that again ruin this novel. Several points I've been holding back on until we reach this point that can finally be addressed. The first glaring problem is the disappearances. The book assumes that this is the work of the rapture. Only a couple of people believe that so far, but no other explanations are being addressed. If the authors wanted to build a strong case for the rapture happening, they should look at the other possibilities and present sound arguments against them. On a side note, there is a growing movement of Christians that do not believe in the rapture. I previously mentioned that the late Pat Robinson of the 700 Club did not believe in the rapture. The general idea is that certain key verses in the Bible are either mistranslated or misunderstood. The concept of the pre-tribulation rapture was first introduced in the 1800s. Up until that point, there was no teaching that such an event would take place. Pastors have long since used the concept to fearmonger in order to get people to convert. For the sake of this narrative, we have to assume there were massive disappearances of people believed to be either Christian theists or young children. One fault is that we know very little about who disappeared or if they shared any other connections that might reflect on why they were targeted and not others. The numbers presented in the book seem very suspect. One example was in a Christian school in Indonesia that holds an estimated 200 students. We are expected to believe that only 1 student was left behind. This seems highly unlikely. A vast majority of theists have many different beliefs on how they are allowed to behave in the eyes of their gods. Christians are no exception, with the vast majority belonging to different denominations. Everyone seems right in their own eyes, but if a God exists, what does he use as a criteria? The Bible? What the Bible says and how it contradicts itself, and because it is not very straightforward, that is why there are many denominations, because no one can agree on which passages mean what. So hypothetically, what could cause these disappearances? Other than the pre-tribulation rapture. Sorry to burst anyone's bubble, but God is not the only answer. The TV series 4400 had a rapture-like event when time travelers from the future took people. It could be aliens. Zeus, if he existed, could have gotten pissed and eradicate the offending Christians. doesn't mean only the Abrahamic gods are the only options if we resort to lowering oneself to believe in them. The one-world government that forms after the disappearances states that the quote, scientific, end quote explanation for the disappearances is that it is the fallout of nuclear weapons that made people vanish. Nothing in any real description is stated. This shows the author's lack of understanding in science. Their explanation falls under pseudoscience, and they are trying to state that scientists can only create a lame explanation of why millions would disappear. The straw man argument goes on to say that only Christianity can give the real answers about what is going on. This also assumes that every reported disappearance is accurate and not a falsehood being reported. There are people that like attention and jump in on the latest trends, trying to state that what is happening is also happening to them. So who is to say that everyone that reports people vanishing are not just making up people that vanished, when those people either have been dead for years, are still alive and are not part of the vanished, or could have been made up and never existed? Rayford continues by asking himself what happens next, and are the disappearances the end of it? This again makes no sense, considering the character in question has been to church numerous times and had discussions with his former wife about the rapture and the end times. Considering how often this topic is addressed in churches, his questions don't make sense for him to be asking them. These questions would be better suited to someone who has never gone to church before and has never been a believer. Even if Rayford has never paid attention at all to these topics, he would have a little inkling to answer his own questions. Because of the repetitive nature in which churches bring up these topics, Rayford makes several leaps here because he assumes that heaven is real and so is God and the rapture. So he asks what will happen to him when he dies now that the rapture happened. He wonders if he will go to hell or not. He reflects that his wife used that tired old adage that God is loving. Then he leaps to God's love had been pushed to its limits, and this forced God to react this way. So if God is supposed to be a God of infinite love, then how can it be pushed to its limits? Once you put a limit to an infinite, then the infinite stops being infinite. The same thing applies when an apologist says that God is all-powerful, but he can only act in a way that is consistent to its nature. That puts a limit on their God, and their God no longer becomes infinite. We get more Christian rhetoric as Rayford ponders that he doesn't know everything like he thought he did. Realizing he had believed in himself too much, he suddenly feels humbled and worthless. Typically the only ones that think they know everything are Christians in general. Although they try and paint atheists like that, it could not be farther from the truth when you actually talk to an atheist. While there may be bad atheists out there, typically Christians try to paint us in an unrealistic bad light to rationalize their own bad behaviors. Rayford goes on to wallow in self-pity and thinks about finding what Christians call truth with his daughter that was left behind with him. He thinks about his son and realizes how coddled he was raised, and remembers he was worried that he was a mama's boy, but luckily he was not effeminate. He never had the alpha male attitude, and this worried Rayford, but now he is glad he didn't. You have to love the homophobic effeminate remark, as if his son being effeminate is so bad to him. This veiled attempt to take a jab at the LGBTQ+ community is so sad that it shows how little and insignificant Christians are. They are trying to fight a war with a community that could care less about their religion and laugh at their feeble attempts to seem relevant. The real worrisome thing is the overly sheltered life they are forcing on their son. Had the disappearances not happened, then continuing to shelter their son makes it difficult for him later in life. Many have trouble fitting in with their peers and interacting in job situations, and many end up leaving their faith once they leave their sheltered bubbles and experience life. Next the scene changes to Buck. He's staying at a run-down hotel and calling his father to learn how the family is coping. He learns that his sister and her kids vanished as they were on their way to church. His father tries to make peace with him over a long-standing feud, but Buck refuses. The supposed bad blood between them was that Buck went to college instead of working the same job as his father did. This is odd because most parents want their children to go to college to get better jobs. A recent poll had 9 out of 10 parents wanting their children to attend college, even though their faith in the college system was fading by what was being taught. A more reasonable tact would be how they treated each other, but this seems more propaganda. The Christian community use this to get their members to not send their kids to college because the children seem to leave the religion once they learn about the lies they have been indoctrinated with. Though one could say this will happen eventually, college seems to be a big hindrance to religion. Another reason Christians like to homeschool is that it helps keep the children indoctrinated rather than exposing them to new ideas. The writers just spent a couple of pages going over that Buck and his family have no idea what happened or the reason behind the disappearances. His father makes it a big point to say that Buck's brother, Jeff, has no idea what is going on and why his sister and family had vanished. Typical of the writers, Buck's father now states that Jeff has an idea about what happened. We know the Bible is full of contradictions, but there is no need for Christian novels to be full of them as well, is there? Buck's father says that he spoke to the pastor of their church and the pastor believes the disappearances are nothing to do with religion because if they were then he would have disappeared also. Next, the owner of the hotel calls and tells Buck the pilot he wants to hire called for him while he was talking to his father. Buck gets into an argument because the owner asks him about the phone call because Buck would have to pay for lodgings now if he hoped to leave before 7 a.m. Buck points out that he already gave the owner his credit card number. Then Buck tries to bribe the guy with a traveler's check. This is more useless filler and adds no real value to the story other than Buck is supposed to be the smartest man in the room. This concludes with Buck using an old trick of looking at a clock and telling yourself when you want to wake up. This gets blown up as if it's some amazing ability that Buck has, despite that most people can do this. Scene goes back to Rayford and he gets a call from a friend of his daughter. He learns that Chloe is on her way but has no way to call him. They talk a bit about who lost who and how they are feeling. More filler with no relevance. Rayford picks up a newspaper and reads about Nicolae Carpathia was unanimously elected as president of Romania. Rayford thinks he looks like a young Robert Redford as he looks at the picture. Another comment gets made here that democratic elections became out of date as he was elected by consensus. Failing to remember that the United States uses such tactics by means of the Electoral College. This ends Chapter 6. See you next time for Chapter 7.